Beginning in the summer of 2020, NorthSTAR put out a call for BIPOC community members to share their experiences of racism in Northfield. The following are the 6 accounts we've received since then. By telling these stories, we aim to empower other Black, Indigenous, and people of color in Northfield to come forward with their own experiences and help galvanize an anti-racist movement for equity in our community. Several of these accounts were read by voice actors with the permission of the individuals who submitted them. One of the accounts contains racial slurs, and viewer discretion is advised.
In middle school, I was riding the bus in the afternoon, and I was sitting by myself, talking to my friend in a different seat. This boy and girl sitting behind me kept pulling and touching my hair, and I really did not like it. I turned around and asked them to stop. They stopped for a couple minutes, and then continued pulling and touching my hair. I got really annoyed and told them to stop again, but they continued. I eventually decided to move into the seat that my friend was sitting in hopes that they would stop touching my hair. They actually got up and reached forward to pull my hair again. They were laughing amongst themselves and talking about how my hair felt to them, calling it weird and poofy. I turned around and told them to stop immediately. I can't remember if they stopped after that, because my stop came shortly after, but I remember the boy laughing and whispering, "Triggered," to me. On a separate occasion in middle school, I was standing by the building talking to some friends, who were all white, before going on my bus. A kid who I didn't know ran up to me and yelled, "Ebola!" in my face, and then ran away towards his bus. When I was in kindergarten, I was the only Black student in my class, and a girl came up to me and asked me if my skin was burned. I told her, "No, my skin isn't burned. I was born this way." In one of my high school classes, we were watching a documentary about the slave trade, and were having a discussion about it afterwards. One kid began to talk about how it's a shame we don't talk about white slavery as much. It was very insensitive, considering we just watched a documentary that was very upsetting for most of the class. Other students, including myself, said that white slavery and Black slavery are not the same thing at all, because white people are not suffering the aftermath like Black people are. The student just shrugged me off and didn't listen whatsoever.
Growing up, I was barely aware that I was one of the few people of color amongst my peers. I knew I was different, but I didn't think it mattered, and it didn't seem to. It was only years later that I realized that my family was one of the earliest immigrant families in Northfield. In 2nd grade, we were learning about slavery when a boy in my class turned to me and said that if we lived back then and in the South, I would be his slave. That he would have me and my family make him tamales all the time. Every time since then, I would cringe when my parents would come to class and bring Mexican food to share with everyone. They would always beam with pride to be able to share part of our culture. And this boy in particular would always go up to them and tell them how much he loved it. But I could never forget the words he said to me about me being his slave. In middle school and high school, I remember being followed by store staff in most stores when I was out shopping with my mom. It would be even harder not to notice after I could tell that they overheard us speaking in Spanish. This happened in Burnsville at the mall, when we were at the Mall of America, and stores here in town. Throughout my entire time in the Northfield public school system, I constantly felt that I had to assimilate to my white classmates, that I had to keep up with them in terms of my academic and economic status. This led to my parents taking on credit card debt, so I didn't feel that I was lacking in anything. But I still felt less than in my abilities and blamed it on being brown and a child of immigrants. I honestly thought I was unintelligent and an imposter. This led to me whitewashing myself as much as possible and wishing I was a WASP like so many of the other students around me. I had 2 separate lives. I lived a public life, fitting in with my white classmates as much as possible, and my private home life where I spoke Spanish and indulged in my Mexican heritage. My dad would accuse me of being ashamed of where I came from. He was not wrong at the time. Junior and senior year, I knew I had to get into the most prestigious, selective private 4-year college possible, because that was what was expected of my white classmates, and thus of myself. I didn't ask for help because none of my friends were. But the difference being was that my friends had parents that had already applied to college and been through undergraduate and even had graduate degrees. I was going to be a first-generation college student. At this point, my own internalized racism was so strong. I looked down on any of my Latinx peers for not being in AP classes, applying to colleges, and still speaking mostly Spanish, and basically anything that made them different from the whitewashed version of myself. It is now, after completing my undergrad, 1 master's program, working on a thesis for a 2nd master's degree, and researching PhD programs, that I realize how crucially beneficial it would have been for me to have teachers and mentors when I was in grade school that looked more like me. To this day, I've only really had 1 mentor that looked like me, and she was my advisor for my undergrad. That is surprising considering after Northfield, I moved to San Antonio, Texas, where the population of Hispanics is much higher. And it is now, as a 28-year-old, that I am making bigger strides in undoing my own internalized racism and prejudice. It is now that I realize how much of those sentiments and ideals came from the silent culture around me while I was in grade school, that it came in part from the lack of representation in those I looked up to. It resulted in me thinking that I could never make it, and if I did, it was going to be a 1 in a million chance. That it also came in part from having very few Black Indigenous people of color as my friends, and that I still feel more comfortable when I'm in a mostly white group. I don't want any other students that go through the Northfield school system to feel like me, and then have years of work ahead to undo so much that they have learned. I want them to feel like they can be themselves and celebrate their home cultures without shame. That they don't feel like they have to live a double life like I did. I want them to be proud of the brown skin or the black skin that they have, and know that they matter just as much as their white classmates, and that they know that everyone else matters just as much, because that is something I didn't realize I had to learn until after I had left Northfield.
Northfield felt safe at the time, but now at 26 years old, I can look back and say there are so many things wrong. Teachers are prejudiced at Northfield. It's blatant and gross. Mr. is a great example. Also, I was always under a microscope. I felt like teachers always had something to say about me and would say it directly to me in a way that they wouldn't have done to other students. I was slut-shamed not only by peers, but faculty as well, and they would talk about me and my clothing openly. The whole Northfield school system also has a problem with treating students of color, especially Black students, as if they're older than they actually are. I felt like many times my own mother would have to step in and remind teachers that I was only 14. Also, when you're addressing bullying, it's important to take into account that white people are taught to think Black people are mean, aggressive, intimidating, and scary. Be fair.
I always got comments about my hair. The first time I straightened my hair and went to school, everyone told me I looked really great, and I also got some comments about looking better. These comments have persisted throughout my life as well. I ended up in the senior superlatives as best hair, which I think was a category created for me. It annoyed me because it seemed like a purposeful singling out. whether or not it was meant to be positive. I was also annoyed because it meant I didn't make the cut for any other academic superlatives. There were plenty of other people with curly hair or interesting hair, but mine was the most fascinating. I am not my hair, and I am not defined by my hair. I didn't like the idea of superlatives in the first place, and I was pretty bummed to find out I had gotten best hair. I was asked to take my hair down for a spontaneous photo in the cafeteria without prior knowledge. If I'm going to get best hair, at least let me have a good hair day.
I was called out to the principal's office for wearing a bandana, while other classmates, white and non-white, were not talked to about removing them until after I had mentioned it. But even then, the teachers just talked to them. They weren't sent to the office. I was working on a project for Science Day and volunteering with another classmate of mine who was also a student of color when my teacher inappropriately touched me. I felt like I couldn't say anything because he was white, male, and in a position of authority. So who was going to believe a teenage Latina? I have been pulled over in Northfield blocks from my house, and once in front of my house, because I was a person of color.
Particularly in 8th grade at the Northfield Middle School, I dealt with racism from students and faculty. In 8th grade, there was a student who would call me Sand N-word. I never knew how to react or deal with the situation. At first I laughed it off, then I took the punches and carried on. It still hurt, especially when my other friends heard it and laughed along. It all started with another student or two making jokes about Middle Easterners, exclaiming the word terrorist. I soon became one of many running jokes. My tan skin was apparently enough to be associated with harmful and derogatory terms towards another ethnic group. I wasn't the only Latino student then, but the one most white students recognized simply by my name. I wasn't white enough for them. I wasn't categorized in the system with the other POC students and how they were segregated in special classrooms based on their family situation. All these kids understood and spoke English. I was raised by a Caucasian father and a Mexican mother. The best parents that I now realized I was lucky to have. After a few months, I ended up reporting this student after angrily crying to my dad about it. He was upset and wanted something to be done. The vice principal spoke with the student, and that student came forward and apologized. He stopped using those words toward me. In fact, we became good friends in our sophomore year of high school. However, our views on politics always got in the way. Other students continued to make these jokes around and towards me, and I gave up. Continuing 8th grade, my group of friends consisted of mostly white kids, a couple of Latinos, and most of the time I was around the Caucasian students. My best friend at the time bullied me to make our group laugh. Some of the other kids used words such as wetback, beaner, Mexican, and terrorist. That best friend of mine and I always had arguments about immigration, racial profiling, abortion, systemic racism, feminism, and political parties. Why did he bring this up knowing I would fully disagree with him? I don't care anymore. Yes, he is white. No, we're no longer friends. There was a time in the lunchroom when there weren't enough seats for students to sit at. Some kids would take an empty chair and sit at a table that had built-in stools. We technically weren't supposed to do this, but a lot of folks did. I saw several white students doing it, and I wanted to sit with my friends, so I copied. The principal approached our table and lectured me on my actions. Less than 15 feet away was a table of white students filling up a table, using extra chairs. They were not reprimanded. Even one of my friends at the time said, "Wow, he just picked out the one colored student he could see." I started getting into trouble shortly after, simply for hanging out with my friends. Sometimes when I got in trouble, I was guilty for something, but most of the time, I just happened to be around at the right moment. Once a faculty member made us sit at our lunch table one day after the bell rang. He dismissed us one by one. I was last. He stared at me, and I glared at him. He waited until I could be late for class. I told my mother about the incident right as she was picking me up. She marched inside, dragged me along, and we met the principal in his office. He backed up the faculty member and his actions and didn't care about my side of the story. The reason behind this was my friends being too loud and disturbing other students. They were asked to quiet down a couple of times while I simply ate. I was always quiet and painfully shy through the entirety of my public school career. There was also a time when a white student asked me, and then stated, "Do you know what a wetback is? It's a Mexican." In high school, there were always a few white students who liked to make racist jokes and who were raised in the more conservative side of homes. I may not have always been verbally assaulted with slurs, but sometimes I'd get, "You're pretty much white," or "You're not like the other Mexicans." These phrases mostly came from the more right-wing students. I shared an essay with a student who I sat with during study hall in my freshman year. My views in the essay were somewhat spiritual as I discussed the topic of people crashing into each other's lives for reasons unknown. He made a joke and said, "Are you Indian?" He and his buddy laughed. "No, I'm not Native American, and no, I'm not Indian." I never had a rebuttal. I've always sat with my rage, shame, and pain for years. I've become paralyzed, trying to figure out how everything is my fault. It wasn't always with racism. So much came from other traumas and mental health issues in my childhood. To this day, I do not know if the principal at Northfield High School didn't care much for me because of my grades or the color of my skin. I rarely had pleasant experiences with him. He always belittled me with his condescending words and manner. And it was always in a cultivated tone, which made it worse.
We hope that stories like these can raise awareness of racism in Northfield. We aim to continue sharing other story submissions in the future.